Welcome to Arts and Entertainment.
With Chris and Randall.
I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
And welcome to the show. This is part 2 of our discussion about politics and art and whether or not, again, Randall, you framed it better than I did.
Well, it's whether that art influences politics, right? Art influences people's minds as regards politics. I guess we're making the case, we're both making the case, aren't we, that art doesn't really matter?
In the first part, we hit stand-up, and then we went to the fine arts. And we picked on the fine arts and stand-up first because they are considered always the most questioning of authority. Of all of the arts, stand-up always is attacking whoever the ruling class is, or the ruler is, or the king. And then the fine arts have always been a haven for intellectuals and critical thinkers. And so far, what we've come to on that part is that the very nature of those art forms basically nullify their own criticism, meaning they exist for such a specific group of people that they're only going to affirm the value of whatever that group of people are. In the last episode, we dealt with stand-up comedy, we dealt with poetry, theater, and literary novels. And all of those things, because they are inherently either part of the fine arts or comedy, they're built to question authority. The people who normally do those things are dedicated to questioning authority. They're the most obvious ones. And I think we both kind of agree that those people aren't really changing society as much as validating the views of those people who already like them.
Right, and I wanted to throw you a curveball, Chris. I mean, I think that maybe the real role of these artists and artworks that are radical, in a sense, is to provide like a safety valve for the people on the margins, right? It's like people who disagree with what's going on in the mainstream society, they can sit back, relax, and enjoy a fantasy land where...
and you raise a good point, and let's get to it, because the difference between, we really haven't talked about the commercial arts yet. We really haven't talked about mainstream, broad, mass appeal entertainment. And that is true. Stand-up is unique because stand-up, you kind of know what you're getting. But the thing about poetry, the thing about literary fiction, the thing about theater is it's inherently for people who already know they want to see something about society. There already is, there are pre-built-in level of expectations. But what we aren't now going to talk about is the stuff that most people encounter when we talk about entertainment or art or mainstream. So one thing I think I want to start with is genre fiction.
Okay.
Genre fiction, I would argue, is one of the most politically conservative art forms.
All genre fiction?
No, but I'm going to talk about the ones that I think are. For example, spies, espionage novels, spy novels. There's a few, some of the best ones that are not, like John le Carré is actually very left of center. But the stuff that I read, Mr. Leftist Chris Corbell, like Threat Vector, about a stolen nuclear submarine that only the government can stop.
It sounds it sounds like Tom Clancy type stuff.
It is Tom Clancy type stuff. And Tom Clancy was absolutely fairly right of center guy. Ronald Reagan actually quoted stuff out of Cardinal of the Kremlin, which is the second Jack Ryan novel, just to explain how SDI Star Wars would work. So yeah, I would definitely say if you look at military fiction, crime fiction, which is normally about, police,
law and
detective,
order.
Law and order.
Good and evil.
Good and evil.
Chris, see, you're bringing up a good point because we talked about this a little bit in the last episode, you've already described yourself as a lefty, right? You're liberal. Yeah. And here you are enjoying these these right-wing works of art. I mean, I won't lie to you. How is that possible?
This is my pornography. It's something I do in private. It's something I rarely talk about. It's something that I find amazingly stimulating in the moment. And when I'm done, I feel nothing but shame.
But you enjoy it.
It's a compulsion. It's an addiction. I've been into it ever since I was 13. And I have to admit, just revealing this among
and one more question.
public media makes me worried that for the rest of my life, I will be tarred and feathered.
Well, one more question.
And rightfully so. I deserve that.
Okay, one more question. Have reading these right-wing works, have they influenced your politics at all?
No, not a damn bit. Not a damn bit. No matter how many times the hero is a member of the most right-wing security apparatus, the hero of the CIA, the Navy, the FBI, a person who fights liberals and communists. Now, I read all this hardcore things where, communists are evil and terrorists are evil, and everywhere you go, only good God-fearing Christians can save our country, or God-fearing Christians and Jews, or God-fearing Christians, Jews and Muslims, whatever. My point is, I read this stuff. It is kind of strange. I mean, in that sense, I don't want to even look for the analogy, but yes, it is. I cannot explain why, on one hand, I find this art form, this mass media art form, incredibly compelling.
It's probably just,
and yet at the same time, it does not change my politics one iota, because even while I'm in the fantasy, which is what you're talking about here, which is art creating a fantasy, because it creates a fantasy universe, I am free in this fantasy universe to detach my own political feelings and buy into a political ideology that I actually don't believe in the same way that if I was reading a book, a Star Wars book, where I get to be Darth Vader, if Darth Vader, if I'm playing a video game, I'm playing as Darth Vader, or I'm reading a book from Darth Vader's perspective, I can enjoy being Darth Vader without actually really being Darth Vader. And strangely enough, I picked on Darth Vader because he doesn't exist in the real world. He's considered a recognized form of evil, and everyone is open to being Darth Vader. So if everyone is open to being Darth Vader, then I guess when I'm reading these war-thrilling techno thrillers, I'm just pretending to be right-wing neocon communist hater. And it's just like playing, it's make-believe. Yeah. It's a safe space for me to explore a point of view that in real life I find abhorrent.
Chris, that's a great point. I love that you made that point, because that's how I've always seen art. Art, it creates a space of where you can have a fantasy, right? I mean, there's no limits. You can imagine anything in that space. But then there's a person, a lot of authoritarians, right? They think that that space, that fantasy space that art creates, will somehow influence public opinion, right? I mean, could I get?
Yeah, and exactly right. There's a thought, and you see it because, first off, and I like that we brought up cops and robbers and spies, because cops and robbers and spies, look, there's a lot of genre fiction. And I really would recommend, if you haven't listened to the one that we did on horror, please go back, because we give horror its due. But the thing about cops and robbers and spies is that in film and TV, as well as the novel, you see these stories play out in all of the popular arts mediums. So yes, your question is, in fantasy, we're given permission, right?
Well, I guess, can we get into authoritarians?
Well, but it's an authoritarian fantasy, right? This authoritarians are making their argument. There was a show in the early 70s called Today's FBI. And the FBI actually helped produce that show because they wanted people to see the FBI in a positive light after there was already so much negative information coming about the FBI. So would you argue that on some level, every time the United States Navy or armed services contributes its military to movies like Top Gun or the Jack Ryan films or the Jack Ryan TV show, that this is authoritarians using their power to help propagate their views through art?
I guess we're getting into the question of, does propaganda work? Does advertising work? Yeah. And, it's interesting. I wish I had a link to this, but I remember there was a historian talking about Nazi propaganda, for instance. And Nazi propaganda, I don't know if you've looked at it, but it's very
I have.
heavy-handed. It's very heavy-handed and unsophisticated. And there's historians who have made the case that Nazi propaganda was not effective. I mean, it didn't influence people's minds. It just led
Really?
people.
So Lean Riefenstahl, who did Triumph of Will, which is something we always consider one of the great propaganda documentary films. Richard Nixon aired it in the White House.
Well, Triumph of the Will is unusual. Most of the Nazi propaganda was heavy-handed and unsophisticated. Okay, and not, and it wasn't very influential. Some historians have argued it was more. It told people what they needed to publicly believe.
Yeah.
Right. It was basically just informational. Which is, and you get into propaganda. Advertising, I think, is a form of propaganda. I mean, propaganda is really a form of advertising, really. But you get into advertising, and it's like companies are trying to use art to influence your purchasing decisions, right? And that form of art, advertising as a form of art, is really we could probably do a whole show on that, but it's
We
really
will do a whole show on that. So hold us that we will come back to.
advertising is really more informational, I would argue. It's giving people information that they're going to use to make purchases. I mean, sure, there's an emotional reactionary aspect to it, perhaps, but and there's also a repetitive aspect to it to just remind you to buy something over and over. But I don't know how effective it is at just actually influencing opinion, and we were talking before the show too about Stalin and Soviet art, and how influential was Soviet art in influencing people's opinions. I mean,
Well, all of this is important stuff, and we're really getting into now, and maybe we'll hold back for just a brief moment because there's a lot to be said on that topic, which is mainstream. The thing about mainstream art and the powers that be is that there isn't always, and we'll go into greater depths later, but there is an unholy alliance, meaning that TV shows and movies are owned by companies that have ads. And if they don't have ads, they have subscribers. And the key for ads is not to offend your advertisers, and the key to subscribers is not to lose your subscribers. So built into mass entertainment is the desire not to alienate any political point of view. Right now, I guarantee you, we've probably lost some people. Not because we're long and boring and ponderous like usually, but because there's people who are like, I'm a staunch fascist, and you're making it seem like fascists just don't have any appreciation for the arts, so I am done with you. Now, this is my bigger point, and I really want to get back to what you're saying in a moment. But if you look at, I'm going to walk away from TV for just a second and look at cinema. If you look at popular films in the last 20 or 30 years or 40 years that are political in nature, that do well, that people see, they're always kind of part of history. They're rarely about what's going on today. And they normally deal with a part of history. Like I've noticed there are a tremendous amount of films about the Bush administration, right? We talked about The Hurt Locker, Vice,
Zero Dark 30,
which is Bush and Obama, yeah. And then the one that came out last year, Redacted, I think was what it was called, about torture techniques.
Oh, right. I don't think it's redacted. I have to look it up.
Right. And then there was the one about Valerie Palmer's outing. What was that called?
I don't remember either.
I know. We looked it up last night and then we promptly forgot it. But it's a great film with Naomi Watts and Sean Penn. And yes, I've heard people say, why don't you guys actually, you know what? It's the age of Google. We've given you enough. You go Google it. But my point is, all of these quote unquote political films that focus on things that happened during the Bush administration all come down to just really two things. They come down to, did Bush manipulate 9/11 so that we would invade Iraq? Or did we use, was it right for us to use torture to interrogate? Did we spy on Americans? was a loyal member of the intelligence state, outed because her husband wrote an article that criticized the president. But it's never really there's nothing in any of those films, I would argue, that really talk about what's wrong with a Republican ideology, a war hawk ideology, a military industrial complex that funds itself. It always comes down to these moral tales of, is it wrong or is it right, right?
Yeah,
It
you're making a good
personalizes
point.
the
Yeah,
conflict.
they're not about the system; they're about the characters. I mean, I'm thinking now of movies where they try to portray Bush and his cronies as like idiots. So it's
Yeah,
almost like they're making the point where they're making the point. Well, if only there were smart people leading our government, it would be great. I mean, that's all that really matters. I mean, our government's fine. It's just we need smart people leading it.
right. And it's
I,
funny too, because I deliberately ignored W, because I really feel that all of Oliver Stone's political films, W, Nixon, JFK, all of his presidential films, I feel on some level we've already labeled him an agitational propagandist. So it's as if by labeling him an agitprop filmmaker, and because he sometimes does not have fidelity to the actual historical facts, he can say what he wants to say, but whatever he wants to say is immediately dismissed in the same way a stand-up comic is dismissed,
well,
or a piece of theater is dismissed.
a lot of these movies that have a political bent and they have an obvious political bent, it's really fascinating to me to see the kind of reactions they get from critics who, have a critics who are like more right wing. They always come out with reviews when these movies come out about how these movies are false and they're lies, and um, they're portraying everything wrong, and so these movies aren't changing minds. I mean, when did a conservative critic watch like a George Bush movie and say, you know what, this movie changed my mind about the Bush administration?
Well, I mean,
Thank you for making this movie.
I saw the Michael Bay film about Benghazi, which was very entertaining, and it absolutely did not change my mind about Obama or Benghazi at all. But
I'm
I
going
just
to
want to
watch
talk about
that.
I want to talk about Oliver Stone for a second, because Oliver Stone is the only. John Sayles is too, but John Sayles is really rarefied air, whereas Oliver Stone is the only filmmaker I know, well, one of two, but he's the only one who's really out there talking about a systematic issues and ideological issues. But because he is an agitational propagandist, because he does not have a fidelity to the facts, because we've already placed a label on him that we place on our Arthur Miller plays, as we mentioned before, or Lenny Bruce, is that, yeah, he's a pot smoker. Yeah, he's a little nutty. So like it allows us to still not question our own society because he's the one doing it. I would argue we are not including Michael Moore because he's a documentary filmmaker, but God knows Michael Moore is probably the closest we've come to somebody in the commercial arts who can get his movies into theaters that can actually attack a system.
Yeah, he gets the same pushback that these other political directors get for their fiction movies or their historical fiction. They call him a liar. They say he's making stuff up. He's a fantasist. And I have yet to hear somebody say, "Oh, I watched Michael Moore's movie. It changed my mind."
Well, it's possible, in fairness, that they do, only because I think that documentary film is inherently, even if it uses agitational propaganda techniques, it raises enough issues that it resonates with people who come from maybe a more conservative background. I do remember watching Roger and Me when it came out in '86, being in college and not knowing anything about modern American labor. And it did actually, I guess in that sense, I already had that point of view. So yes, it was already invalidating and affirming my own beliefs, which is a real shame, because I guess even people like Roger, even people like Michael Moore kind of fall into that same problem of being like a little bit like Oliver Stone. They're sensationalistic, they're agitprop, a little bit like stand-up comics, they're inherently funny. And you're right, I just don't think they convert. Nor do I think they're inherently dangerous, because we label them as humorists or clowns so that whatever they're saying isn't today, Michael Moore, and God knows I'm dating myself because today is August 31st, 2020, just posted on Twitter why he thinks Donald Trump is going to get reelected because the Biden campaign is not campaigning in Michigan and no one is taking him seriously. So you could definitely say that there is no medium, and certainly not the arts, where someone who can say something that is prescient and true, unless he's wrong, but he did say this in 2016, the arts is not an effective place for that person. At least not even something like a movie, like a documentary that can be in like an AMC theater. Now, the one person I've ignored, and let's hit him and hit him hard, is Aaron Sorkin.
Well,
Right.
Sorkin's interesting. I mean, because he's a very inside baseball. He's concerned mostly with what goes on behind the scenes, how people are behind the scenes. I don't know how concerned Sorkin really is with politics and policy. I mean, he seems to be more interested in, which is why he can make a compelling script. You know, he seems to be more interested in the personalities behind these behind what's going on in the government, in power. Right? I mean, he's.
Yeah, I think that Sorkin is actually, in some senses, the worst. Like Sorkin on the outside surface seems like a liberal fantasy. Like, yeah, he's socially progressive. Yeah, he's really arguing for change in our society. And, you know, he did the Newsroom where he attacks people like Romney, and he did the West Wing where he has a lot of bad Republicans in it. And even if you really get down to it, A Few Good Men is very much an attack on ultra anti-communist military, right? Like, we guard the wall, you know.
I don't know. I think he gives those people a lot of
speech, right? But you can't
yeah.
handle the truth, right?
He gives those people their due. Yeah.
He gives those people their due. And, you know, I remember the last season of West Wing, he comes up with the Republican who runs against Santos. Santos is supposed to be Obama, but I can't remember now. A California senator who's a Republican, played by Alan Alda, one of the most biggest liberals there is. And they make him like a John McCain, you know, like a Republican with gravitas. And it just becomes very clear that really, he's the epitome of what's wrong to me. Sorkin always attacks. He only is a champion for social liberal issues, you know, that have to deal with not with economics, but just have to do with like social stuff. And he always argues that really we're all the same, you know, and Republicans and Democrats who aren't crazy, as long as they're not crazy, they can meet in the middle.
Well, you're making a case that he's really politically moderate, which I would agree with, honestly.
Well, it's worse because it's just worse with Sorkin than it is with Stone. Stone can be written off as a lunatic, and people go, he's so funny and entertaining. Michael Moore, he's so funny and entertaining. But Aaron Sorkin, he's a reasonable guy, though I'm a Republican or I'm a wealthy Democrat. I like that, you know, he says that really as long as we are good about social issues, economic issues just don't matter.
But Chris.
And economic issues is really where I feel art and mainstream art, it's the place they will not go.
Well, you're right. But Chris, aren't we making the point that art doesn't really seem to influence politics or public opinion? I mean, aren't we making that point?
Well, I would just say that I'm not sure yet. All I can say is that Aaron Sorkin is something unique, which is I feel that he is coasting off our society's desire for finding a way of making political art that is not political. You know, like he's the Diet Coke of politics. Meaning, I know you like the taste of Coke, but you don't want the sugar. So like you like the feeling of politics, but you don't want to actually have politics. Same with House of Cards. If you ever watch the English version of House of Cards, it's a tremendously political center-left show. But when you watch the American version of House of Cards, no, not a bit. You know,
It's just about pure power.
it's about pure power. He's a Democrat and he's evil. See, that's progressive. You know, and if you watch Madam Secretary, it's the same thing. Like there are anytime it's whether it's TV or film where we deal with politics in this country, we always bring it down to a bad person, bad actors, not bad ideology.
Well, Chris, do you believe? It sounds like you're starting to soften on this point. Do you believe art matters? Do you believe art influences public opinion?
All I can say at this juncture is when you look at things like film and television and even genre fiction, it becomes clear that there are a lot of people who are trying to make money as artists off of the fact that people don't really want political art that challenges their beliefs. So in that sense, they're not being censored. They're doing the opposite. They're literally appeasing the fascists or the controllers.
Right. Well, this is an interesting point because
Or they believe it because they're right wing. I don't know.
right. Well, you're making the point that most art it does reinforce social narratives. You're into Bertolt Brecht territory here,
Yeah.
and so it's really hard to say if art is influential, right? Because when art deviates from the mainstream narratives, it gets shut down. It gets attacked mercilessly, doesn't it? I mean, let's look at the comic book code, right?
Yeah, let's do that. Comic books is actually great. Let's look at comics for just a sec. Before we even get into the old school comics, let's look at comic book movies today, right?
Okay.
Comic book movies are inherently very much like war movies. You have this great thing on war movies. Please say it again, because in our pre-discussion you talked about it. Before I get into comic,
remind me what I said.
That, well, not only do you see this in movies about politics, but movies that are about war never really attack the ideology behind the war, right? Like movies about Vietnam really don't get into the ideology of Vietnam. You said this about The Hurt Locker. It never really gets into the ideology of what we were doing.
Well, I think The Hurt Locker is like there were forerunners, but I think The Hurt Locker is the prototype of the war movie that's apolitical.
Yeah, right? Because it's just about a man. He could be anywhere, right?
Right. It's just about a guy doing a job who happens to be in a war.
Right. And then the bigger question, same with American Sniper by Clint Eastwood, right?
Right.
He's just a very good sniper.
Right. I mean, that's just his job. I mean, he could be a postal clerk.
Yeah. Right. So, it's so, and it gets to this weird place, I think, in Zero Dark 30, where no one likes Osama bin Laden. So, yeah. No one likes Osama bin Laden. You obviously don't like him. Oh, wait a second. They're using cruel and unusual torture devices to get to this fact.
Well, that's the great thing about Zero Dark. Right. That's the great thing about Zero Dark 30 is the movie tries not to take a stand on whether or not torture is effective.
Yeah.
I think I would say.
I would agree. It's trying not to. It's the same filmmaker, Kathryn Bigelow, who made Hurt Locker, who was trying not to make a stand on whether or not we should have been in Iraq or Afghanistan. I don't remember, but I should have checked it
right.
out.
There's an interesting movie, and by contrast, there's an interesting movie. I think it's called Green Zone, starring Matt Damon.
Oh, I saw that.
I believe Green Zone very explicitly makes the case that we should not be there, and the whole war was ridiculous.
And I believe that was Paul Greengrass, who makes these great political films and Bourne movies, because he did Flight United 88. Greengrass, by the way, started out as a journalist back in the 70s. He interviewed a member of MI5 and put out this book called Spycatcher. And the British government prevented him from publishing the book for a very long time. And they had to redact all this stuff. And he was considered this horrible man for trying to show how the government apparatus works.
Well, this shows a great contrast between Greengrass and Bigelow. Bigelow, who made Hurt Locker. Greengrass is a former journalist. He's concerned with how the world works. He's interested in how the world works. He wants to know the truth about things. Bigelow is merely, I don't know, I guess the best word for it is a toady. She makes movies for the powerful.
In Hollywood.
She makes movies
to be married to
James Cameron.
Right.
And then she became a lesbian. Became, quote unquote.
Well, I don't know if that's what makes her bad. I just know that
I'm not saying she's bad. I'm just saying they're obviously two different people with two different life arcs.
But she is a product of, actually, full disclosure, my sister worked with her on commercial once and said she's just a horrible person.
Well,
So I'm very
obviously
prejudiced against Kathryn Bigelow.
She's
So,
obviously somebody who is wants power and makes movies to appease power. I mean, that's quite
she's
obvious.
definitely, I would say that Kathryn Bigelow is definitely part of, she's Hollywood. She does big blockbuster films. And this is she did Zero Dark 30, and Hurt Locker is a foray into what's called the war movie. And I think she honestly and naively believed that she could do this in an apolitical manner.
Well, I don't think she was naive at all. I mean, she knew exactly what she was doing, and now she's a big director. I mean, of course, the powers that be want a political war movie. That's exactly what they want. You know, I've noticed something about, now we're going off on a crazy tangent, but I've noticed something about modern American war movies, which, you know, a lot of these superhero movies I might include in that category. Modern American war movies seem to be a celebration of America. And that's
absolutely right. And let's go right to the superhero movie, because the superhero movie is exactly in the same field. The superhero movie, classically apolitical, classically deals with good versus evil, ultimate good versus ultimate evil. The films take they play well in China. They're designed for other cultures. They don't criticize other cultures. They never deal with issues of class. They never deal with they exist. I found out that Ike Behar, the executive producer up until recently of all the Marvel films, is a major contributor to the Trump campaign. Did you know that? I cannot help but feel that that probably has influenced the stuff, because comic books in its inception was a pretty left of center thing. If you look at the guys who created some of our major superheroes like Superman and Batman and Captain America and the Submariner, these were first generation or immigrant, mostly Jewish people who grew up in the big cities, who were members of organizations like the Art Students League, which is fairly left of center. And they would write, mostly if you looked at comic, like Bob Kane was writing, even though he had a rich guy as his hero, he dealt with issues of class and socioeconomic issues. Superman, Lex Luthor was always a big businessman before he was a supervillain. There is an interesting thing about a guy who had been a news reporter who went undercover for the Ku Klux Klan, and his newspaper article killed the story. So he became a comic book writer, and he wrote an entire series where Superman infiltrates the Ku Klux Klan. And in doing so, it allowed him to write about what the Ku Klux Klan is doing.
Do you know what year that was?
It was in the 40s.
Okay, so this is interesting because I think in 54 is when the comic book code was implemented. That's after Superman saved America from the Ku Klux Klan.
After Captain America starts fighting Hitler a year before America gets involved in World War II, and there were a lot of people in America at that time who actually liked Hitler because they felt the Nazis were going to protect the world from communism.
Right, and the comic book code of 54 was one of the most oppressive forms of censorship ever, I think, in the history of the world. I mean, it basically destroyed the comic book industry. There were dozens of comic book publishers, and it left only like two, right? Marvel and DC.
And it told Marvel and DC what they could do, which is, Superman, they went after Batman and Robin and said there was something unholy or unsound about an older man and a male sidekick. They were implying homosexuality. And it's interesting because instead of they didn't go after the comic books. There was a book that was called The Corruption of Innocence.
Seduction of Innocence.
Seduction of Innocence. So instead of really saying, hey, this is turning America into socially progressive, critical thinkers, they would say, well, psychologically, this is bad for the development of children. And it establishes what would become, because the Hays Code too, I guess, if you went to the 30s, but it's this long-running belief that if you want to censor something in America as a government, you don't challenge it on political territory. You challenge it on the health of children's psychological development.
Well, this is like a whole other subject practically. It's like, so we're asking the question, does art influence the public? And then you get into this question of does art influence the growing young mind? You know, and in 1954 they asked that question and said yes, and they banned practically all the comic books.
It's a very interesting story too, because EC Comics, which also put out Mad Magazine, they had Tales from the Crypt, and all they did was horror comics, just frightening horror, monster, torture. Really, if there was ever a comic book company who should have been banned or censored, it was EC for its graphic use of violence and monsters. There's that famous cover. You gave me the book where there's like a little piece of wood that it's about to pierce someone's eye. You remember? Because you gave me the book. I still have this book. I got to return it to you. It's only been 15 years, so I'll get around to it soon. But they were able to not be censored because they said that EC stood for Educational Comic Book. So
Brilliant.
They were able to not only write things that were just completely psychologically devastating, but they were able to write stories about like Nazis in hiding. They were able to put out Mad Magazine, which was very much satire, at least got to be critical of society. But DC and Marvel, all they could do, because they saw that, was put out monsters and modern romance. That was it. Just love stories, Archie comics, science fiction stories. All of Superman's villains start to become zilly. Like, that's where you get Mr. Meeplex. That's when all of a sudden you have like the Riddler and the Batman characters become. Marvel puts out no superheroes in the 50s.
You know, I want to say
completely non.
Right, and I want to say by contrast. Okay, so here's an interesting contrast. So Japan loved comic books too, and they never implemented a code. Now Japan has always been famously hands off about censorship. They just don't care over there. And their comic book industry grew and matured by leaps and bounds compared to the U.S. comic book industry till we got to the modern era where their animated TV shows based on their comic books have become like a cultural force all over the world.
Well,
And
I will say, go ahead, sorry.
And to argue that, and to make some sort of argument that their art, which has continued unimpeded, uncensored, their comic book art especially, to make an argument that their comic book art has somehow destroyed the fabric of their civilization, warped the minds of the citizens of their country, it would be an impossible argument to make on every social metric that you might measure compared to the United States. Japan is superior. You know, they're superior in education levels and crime and all sorts of things, right? So, I mean, how can anyone make an argument that even exposing young children to any kind of art will somehow warp their mind? I mean, it seems to be an impossible argument to make, honestly. Like, I don't see any evidence that that's the case.
Two things. First off, let me just finish my thought, which is, yes, social criticism and social relevancy did return to comic books in the 60s and 70s. So it was just lost in the wilderness for about late 40s to early 60s. Your bigger question, and is a really great question, is the corruption of youth and censorship is a great place to end this section, because we've really talked about mainstream art, and we've talked about movies and TV, which I really think, in comic books to a degree. But now I really want to get into, with you, the way that governments truly censor or boulderize art, in the way it deals with it and the way it even propagates art. So that will be our third chapter, which is coming up right after this, where now we're not just talking about it around the edges. We're really talking about real intervention and the question of how corruption of the youth is used often as a bulwark. Please stick around for that episode. This is Chris Corbell.
This is Randall.
And we will continue this conversation later. Thank you for listening.